Now, if we look back at the First World War, and that's what we're here to do this weekend, we've heard of some of these concrete examples where the working class and social movements had a huge effect in, first of all, turning the course of the war and in the end, ending it. It was uprisings in Petrograd, in Berlin, and in Vancouver that had a big effect on how that war happened. And this whole approach is called, quote, history from the bottom up. So we've already heard that class forces drive the system of imperialism that causes modern war. It's the quest for profit in foreign lands, and it's the process of war itself, trying to make money through arms, requisitioning, and all that sort of thing. So the First World War began in 1914 with an assassin's bullet, and it spiraled into a conflict that cost 60 million lives across the globe and brought an end to some of Europe's most powerful monarchies. And Russian workers got rid of their Tsar in solidarity with soldiers. German workers, soldiers, and sailors got rid of their Kaiser in a demonstration that began right around the one-year anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. So the war in Europe ended on Armistice Day, 11 November 1918, with the world aflame in a revolution. And we can get a mood for this time from the following quote, which is taken from the diary of Canada's Prime Minister at the time, Robert Borden, a conservative, who was, right when the war ended in Europe on November 11th, he was riding on an ocean liner, the ship Mauritania, on his way from Canada to Europe for peace talks. And what Borden said was that, quote, revolt has spread all over Germany. The question is whether it will stop there. The world has drifted far from its old anchorage, and no man can with certainty prophesy what the outcome will be. So at the end of the war, we don't hear about it when you go to an Armistice Day or a Remembrance Day celebration or ceremony, but it ended with social unrest erupting everywhere. And this was the tone when the fighting ceased. And it was this climate that brought an end to the war. But those are Royal Northwest Mounted Police on horseback charging through a crowd of war veterans and workers, bringing an end to the Winnipeg General Strike. And here's a photo of the military occupation of Winnipeg, when 4 regiments of the Canadian Army set up machine guns in major intersections and put an end to the high watermark of Canada's post-war labor revolt. So what had happened in Winnipeg? And to answer this question, we need to look at changes within Canada's working class during the First World War. And this was a process of growing industrial militancy and also radicalization in the area of ideas that led Canadian workers, or a huge segment of them, to break from employers and the state. So profiteering and the cost of living is something we have to look at to understand why workers grew so unhappy during the war. There was also conscription, so the introduction of the draft, or compulsory military service. And then, of course, as we've already heard, there was the Russian Revolution and Allied intervention. And the final factor, which Ingo alluded to, was the one big union, which was an ideal that never really got implemented in practice because it was cut short by the Winnipeg strike and the state's response to sympathy strikes across the country. So to discuss the rising cost of living, we can look here. This is a quote from Helena Gutteridge, who was an early labor leader in Vancouver, the first woman to serve on Vancouver's Trades and Labor Council. And this statement was made in a speech to the Labor Council in September 1917. And Gutteridge said that, quote, the cold storage plants were groaning with piled up food. One concern on Water Street has so much butter in storage, it was necessary to brace the floors to hold it. So during the war, you had a worsening of the living conditions at home. Industrial production was retooled from the manufacture of consumer goods to the manufacture of arms. Clothing, boots, and shoes, and those types of goods were rediverted from Canada to the Allied soldiers on the Western Front. Food and fuel were diverted from Canadian homes to the trenches of France and Flanders. So the mobilization for, quote, total war created widespread suffering in Canada. Shortages of food drove up costs, and wages didn't keep pace with this inflation. So the majority of workers in Canada saw their living standards decline during the war, but a minority made massive profits. And what Gutteridge was alluding to was the problem of profiteering, where merchants would buy huge quantities of supplies at wholesale prices. They would hoard them in warehouses or even in their basements and then sell them at hugely inflated prices, driving up costs for workers. So basic goods like butter and bacon and meat were hoarded by merchants and sold at huge costs that working people could not afford. So this phenomenon of hoarding and profiteering provoked huge outrage within the working class. So after Helena Gutteridge made this speech in the Vancouver Labour Council, delegates voted for a resolution that called on Canada's food controller, which at the time the government had a bigger role in regulating food. So the Labour Council called on Canada's food controller to, quote, order the release of food so there will be enough to eat. So working class living standards had already been low prior to the war. But the war only made matters worse in the face of this profiteering. Here's a photograph taken from Winnipeg's North End just before the war, and it shows the conditions that a section of Canadian workers lived in. Now, in contrast with these, what we would call today third world conditions, or what was used to be called third world conditions, in contrast with this, Canadian corporations realized huge profits. Just one example from the newspaper of the BC Federation of Labour, the BC Federationist. In 1917, that newspaper reported that the Dominion Steel Company had $15 million sitting in the bank. Other corporations saw profits of more than 400% in a single year. So this created a demand within the working class for the conscription of wealth, that before the state should talk about conscripting any individuals, any workers into the armed forces, they should conscript the wealth of the country first. As events revealed, the government didn't take this advice, which again helped widen the rift between workers, employers, and the state. Now, Helena Gutteridge, who we just looked at, discussed the global conflict in gendered terms. If the present conditions are the best that male statecraft can accomplish, then surely the time has come for women to take her place in the councils of the nations, as an antidote to the present false conception of man that places property and possessions at a higher value than human welfare and life. So this was the backdrop, the state privileging, sorry it's so washed out, the state privileging the war over living standards, subsistence for the working class, and over the lives of workers themselves by waging this bloody war in Europe. There's a photo taken from the Somme, the trenches around the Somme River in France. And this area saw some of the fiercest fighting of the First World War. And there's a quote there from a Victoria worker named Frederick Carn, who was a salesman during peacetime, but he served as a stretcher bearer, removing bodies killed in the fighting. And what Carn wrote in a letter to his mother was, quote, that hellhole called the Somme, an infernal war every minute of the day. That preliminary bombardment was something awful. The thousands of shell holes in around the village amply testify. And it is over similar obstacles that every foot of the way back to the Rhine will have to be fought. So the scale of fighting in Europe was resulting in a huge number of deaths and injuries for Canadian soldiers, British soldiers, and French soldiers. And the number of voluntary recruitments was drying up. So the Allies simply did not have enough bodies to fight the war they were trying to fight in Europe. In this offensive alone, at the Somme River, 24,000 Canadians were killed or wounded. And the Allies saw 600,000 soldiers killed or wounded in that single offensive, which moved the front lines 6 kilometers to the northeast. There were other huge battles like this that resulted in no gains, and battles that now go down in history as moments of glory, where thousands and thousands of men were slaughtered. At Passchendaele Ridge, at Ypres. So the Allied military strategy and also the German strategy was predicated on what's called a war of attrition, based on the belief that the Allies could sustain a greater number of losses than Germany. So you would send huge armies to battle each other. A huge percentage of those armies would be killed, but whatever side had the greater number of troops would win. In the French army, this logic provoked huge mutinies in the spring of 1917, when soldiers in one half of all French army divisions refused orders to advance, and many of them deserted from the front. So in Canada, there was real pressure to produce more troops. And it was during the Somme campaign that's depicted in that photo that Canada took a big step towards conscription. And it didn't originally bring in the draft. It brought it in two stages. The first stage was to bring in what was called national registration. And this required all men of adult age in Canada to register with the state. And this is similar to what you have in the United States right now, where all men at the age of 16 or 18 have to complete a form and submit it to the state. And failure to complete that form makes you ineligible for student loans, employment for any federal public agencies like the Postal Service, or any jobs funded by the federal government. So right now, the Americans have a registration of their adult men, which leaves them basically in readiness to bring in conscription. Well, in Canada, this type of registration was implemented in autumn of 1916, as so many Canadians were being killed at the Somme. So Labour knew that this meant conscription was coming. Originally, the government said that, oh no, we're not going to bring in conscription. We just need to register the manpower so we can organize industry better. But Labour knew conscription was coming, so it called for a boycott of this registration system. And it urged workers to refuse to fill in these registration cards. Now, in this climate, basically, as Canada was preparing to bring in conscription, there was a meeting held in Revelstoke in the BC interior. And it was the 1917 annual convention of the BC Federation of Labour. And at this convention, a slate of Socialist Party members took control of the provincial executive, the executive of the BC Fed. And the Socialist Party was a Marxist party that had elected MLAs to the BC legislature. And just a few of the socialists who now controlled the BC Fed, they included Joseph Naylor, who was a coal miner from Cumberland on Vancouver Island. They included Victor Midgley, who was secretary of the Vancouver Labour Council. And they included Ginger Goodwin, who was a coal miner from Yorkshire, England, and business agent for the Smelter Workers Union in Trail, BC. And in 1916, so 1 year earlier, Goodwin had run as a socialist candidate in the provincial election. At this Revelstoke convention, he was elected as the BC Fed's vice president for the West Kootenay region. So alongside the election of this socialist slate to control the BC Fed, there was also a referendum that was endorsed by the delegates. And here's the wording. So this referendum asked the affiliated workers in BC, quote, "Are you prepared to place in the hands of the executive the power to call a general strike in the event of conscription?" And voting took place throughout the spring of 1917. And the outcome overwhelmingly favored a down tools policy. Of the workers who voted, 2,400 favored the down tools policy, and only 576 were opposed. So these ideas weren't confined to the British Columbia working class, and they were strongest in the province of Quebec. But despite this opposition, the Conservative government of Robert Borden brought in the Military Service Act in June 1917. And this act split the Liberal Party of Canada. A group of Liberals stayed loyal to their leader, Wilfrid Laurier, a former Prime Minister, who formed a bloc of anti-conscription Liberals in the House of Commons, consisting mainly of Quebec MPs. However, other Liberals joined with Borden to form what was called a union government. And in 1917, at the end of 1917, Borden and his, quote, unionists won an overwhelming majority in the House of Commons on the issue of conscription. Now, this election was suspect. For example, there was something called the Wartime Elections Act. And this act extended the vote to women, but not to all women. only to the wives, mothers, and sisters of soldiers, so women who were most likely to support the conscription policy. Women who did not have a vested interest in a supply of more troops were not granted the vote. In this election, BC's labor movement fielded 8 candidates on a platform of, quote, abolishing profit-making. They were all defeated as the boarding unionists took all 13 BC seats. The Labour candidates took about 8% of the vote in the seats they contested in BC. So conscription became law in Canada, and workers began to be jailed for refusing to fight overseas. And the most high-profile episode was, of course, Ginger Goodwin, who had led a strike of smelter workers in Trail, BC. But we'll get into that in 1 second. Here's a quotation from Goodwin in a letter in November 1917, published just a few days before the Bolsheviks took power in Russia, to touch on the global context. The letter read, quote, "War is simply a part of the process of capitalism. Whether the capitalist system can survive this cataclysm remains to be seen. It is the hope of the writer that capitalism will fang itself to death, and out of its carcass spring the life of the new age, with its blossoms of economic freedom, happiness, and joy for the world's workers." So these were Goodwin's views, and a week after he wrote this letter, or 5 days after he wrote this letter, the Bolsheviks took power in Petrograd, and about 10 days after he wrote this letter, Goodwin's union, the smelter workers, shut down the smelter in Trail. And it wasn't just any old factory, it was a key factory in the Allied war effort. The Consolidated Mining and Smelting Company smelter at Trail produced zinc and magnesium for the Allied arms. So there was a real strategic threat posed by Goodwin's strike. So midway through this strike in Trail in November 1917, Goodwin was recalled before the local draft board and had his classifications changed. He had black lung from work in the coal mines, but he was classed, quote, fit for military service. So he fled the interior and went to Vancouver Island, where he hid in the hills with a group of draft resistors. Here's a photo of Comox Lake, and Goodwin camped up around this corner at a camp just in a tributary of the Comox Lake called the Cruikshank River. And he camped there with a half dozen other draft resistors, and he was supplied with food and other supplies by the workers of Cumberland, which was a very class-conscious coal mining district. In July 1918, Ginger Goodwin was shot dead by a Dominion policeman. The police officer claimed to have killed the union leader in self-defense, but the labor movement cried murder. Vancouver sent a delegate to Cumberland to investigate. And at the same time, the Labour Council of Vancouver voted 117 in favor, with 1 opposed, to hold a 24-hour, quote, general holiday to protest Goodwin's killing.